Good morning and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hammi. Today, we're here to talk about weed or marijuana, cannabis, ganja, grass, and another name for it? Loud, sour. I think that's just a strain or
Fire.
yeah. Or whatever you call it, wherever you're from. To help us address this topic today, we are joined by Joe Gilmore and Dr. Jeffrey Moyer. Joe Gilmore here is a graduate of UMass Boston. He serves as the Cannabis Fund Manager in the Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity and Inclusion for the City of Boston. On the other side, we have Dr. Jeffrey Moyer. He joins us as a visiting lecturer in public policy and public administration. Dr. Moyer earned his doctoral degree in public policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Welcome to the show. I'm happy to have you here. And to get us started, each guest is going to have 5 to 7 minutes to offer their perspective on this issue. Joe, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Hammi, for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here to share, some of what I've learned from working in the city of Boston in I call it the cannabis department, but it's actually the economic opportunity inclusion. And so we focus on the Boston Equity Program, which was created to help people in the city of Boston who are harmed by the war on drugs, disproportionately impacted, get a leg up so that they can gain generational wealth through the economic opportunities in the cannabis industry. Mainly my role is to oversee this equity fund, give out information and resources about the Boston Equity Program, and primarily I manage the Boston Equity Fund, which provides up to $15,000 grants for social equity or Boston equity applicants. These funds are extremely crucial because it's extremely expensive to get a cannabis license, not just in the city of Boston, but also across the state. It can take anywhere from $1 million to $3 million to $5 million, depending on the type of license. And generally, people who are harmed by the war on drugs or have been arrested in the past for cannabis have been targeted. There's instances of redlining in our community, of mass incarceration, which really affected the ability for our local residents to participate in the legal cannabis industry because of how expensive it is.
Right.
And so through the Boston Equity Ordinance that was passed in 2019 by then acting Mayor Kim Janey, we've created this program with the city of Boston that's going to help people receive access to grant funding, to technical assistance, because not only is there a financial component missing from our communities in order to participate, but also the knowledge that it requires to pass through the licensing process, to run a successful business and maintain and get through the local municipal processes. And that's just not common knowledge for everybody, especially if you've been harmed by the war on drugs. And so this equity program is really focused on empowering people, sharing resources, and trying to push the needle forward for equality and equity in the business sphere. This cannabis industry, it's really an economic vehicle. I see it as a pathway for not just people who are interested in cannabis, but anybody who's doing whatever their normal job is in their career. They can probably apply it to the cannabis industry, whether you're an accountant, whether you're a janitor or construction person or HR. There are many transferable skills that our communities currently have that could be transferred into this new industry. Mainly, I'm focused on trying to get the word out as much as possible. I'm try to keep as active as possible within the community and the organizations that exist that are pushing for social justice and equity, to make sure that everybody's plugged in and nobody is left out. Really recurring quote that comes to mind over the past couple of years is, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu.
Right.
And so we need to be a part of the development of this cannabis industry so that we can ensure that we're included.
Okay, thank you for that. And Dr. Moyer?
Yep. So Joe here has a great example of a program that as part of my dissertation, I was really looking at this process of innovation, specifically in the cannabis industry. The cannabis legalization, of course, has really developed as innovation and popular attitudes, right? if we go back to Colorado and Washington, those initiatives, legalization, happened as a result of popular campaigns for legalization. And so I think all along the cannabis industry has developed here in the United States through this innovative grassroots approach. And I think that programs like what Joe here has discussed is a really great example of what happens when, democracy, when you actually have people writing policy, people impacted by the policy, writing the policy. So back when I started my dissertation research that you had mentioned, I actually met Joe here at the Question 4 debate that was held at UMass Boston. He was a student activist at the time. I was a PhD student, or early stage PhD student. I obviously then interviewed lots of different people, including Joe, for my dissertation, and I think got some really great perspectives from across the policy landscape here in Massachusetts, as well as more broadly, and just tried to understand how you can really form policy here in the information age, where everyone has access to what happened in Colorado, how that can inform, as well as in other states, obviously, what happened here in Massachusetts. And then what happened here in Massachusetts can impact other states.
Right.
Because Massachusetts learned from previous states, and other states are now learning from Massachusetts.
Okay.
For example, many states learn that social equity can't just be done through technical assistance, right? Certainly technical assistance has a role to help businesses and those impacted by the cannabis criminalization into the industry, but you also need money. You also need funding, whether that's grants or loans. And so states like New York and others have sort of moved into the space by providing social equity funding, dedicated trust fund that's set aside to help people into the industry. And now Massachusetts is sort of learning from those states, and there's a bill before the legislature to help put some money into a trust fund here in Massachusetts and put that into the industry. Wow. So this is evidence of social learning, policy learning, that policy scholars have studied for decades.
Right.
I think this legalization, and particularly the way in which legalization has occurred here in the United States, where most states still have legalized through ballot initiatives, has provided a very particular example of what policy development can look like.
Okay, thank you so much for that, both of you. To get us started, if we're talking about equity, that means there is a presumption or presence of inequity. So, how did we get here?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think that the war on drugs has definitely contributed to the disenfranchisement of many particular groups within the city of Boston, minorities. There's definitely a racial lens when we talk about the war on drugs and its impacts, and how much harm it is, put on some people than others. And for instance, there's a statistic by the ACLU that black people were actually arrested for 3.3 times more than their white counterparts for consuming cannabis after legalization.
Right.
And so we see that there is a targeted sort of law enforcement approach. How did we get here? We got here to this point of actually becoming legalized due to the voices of people who said that the criminalization of cannabis is no longer right, and there's no reason that we shouldn't control and regulate it, because it could be much safer. And
so this refers back to just this how do we get here. So if you're familiar with A New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, she discusses the impact of the war on drugs on criminalization more broadly, and so that her book, which was released, I believe, about 10 years ago now, has certainly had a major impact on the conversation around the war on drugs more broadly. And I think over the past 10 years, it's also impacted the legalization movement in very profound ways. So I think initially when legalization was occurring in early states like Colorado and Washington and Oregon, there was actually a coalition between two different groups. This is very broad. Folks who were advocating for social justice and folks who were advocating for legalization for the market opportunities because they liked weed, whatever. So there was this alliance that existed in this initial states like Colorado and Washington. And over the years, I think it started in Massachusetts, where the social justice grouping, Social Justice Coalition, started speaking out more affirmatively for the need for legalization to actually benefit those communities that had been impacted by criminalization. And it got to the point where when legalization came in New York, and it was a legislative campaign, the social justice advocates basically said, we don't want legalization unless it's socially just. So you saw in New York, that was a crucial part. In 2018, it failed, in part because of pressure on social justice, and then it ended up passing because social justice was entrenched into that proposal, and it ended up passing with the loan fund that I mentioned earlier and some other aspects, equity aspects as well. So I think this importance of social justice in the legalization landscape is becoming more and more important, and I think that just, again, speaks to this innovative space that cannabis exists in.
And as a native of Dorchester, have you seen the impact that drug laws have had on your community, and how do you react to double standards that you've seen when it comes to the way the law treats different consumers of marijuana based on race? Yeah,
so I've had many people in my life who have been affected by cannabis prohibition. My brother, he was expelled from school for having a roach. I've had friends who've, they're D-techs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like the undercover police that many times will be patrolling inner city neighborhoods like Dorchester, and they'll pull up on some kids walking by, and sometimes if they can smell or if they can see them smoking, then they'll go up to them, potentially charge them with something else, but their entryway was the cannabis. And so many of my friends have lost opportunities to gain employment or go to school to further advance their lives because of their criminal record, and that hindering them from seeking other employment opportunities or education. So I feel that there's an absolute need to repair those harms because they were created out of policy, and now we have the chance to fix them or address them with policy.
Okay, and then before we talk about addressing these things with actual policy, where does the stigmatization of marijuana come from? Is this actually harmful to youth or communities? There's
been a lot of statistics that have been released from legalization states since legalization occurred. Generally, here in Massachusetts, youth use has not gone up. It's actually gone slightly down, I believe, since legalization. Certainly we can talk about different substances, different drugs having bad impacts on youth. Cannabis in general, certainly when we compare it to alcohol or tobacco or other drugs that are certainly legal on a broader sense, if not legal specifically for youth, cannabis does not have nearly as much of a negative impact. It's not to say we should promote its use. It's just being conscious of this differential impact and what is actually causing youth harm. Just being realistic about that.
And there have been campaigns throughout our society for the past 50, 60 years stigmatizing the use of cannabis. There was the whole Nancy Reagan, this is your brain on drugs, and then people will put it in a sort of negative light. But I think now that there's more research, there's anecdotal evidence for how it looks when cannabis is legalized, and like Jeff said, looking at the research, that the impacts that people thought were going to be there that are negative aren't actually there.
Okay.
And so yeah, it's not as dangerous as Nancy Reagan made it out to be. Okay. It's actually, I think, can be a tool, an economic tool that we can use.
If you don't mind me. So one of the things I always note when I've taught multiple undergrad classes about drug policy, given that's my interest, and one of the questions I almost always ask them when we get into drug policy is, how many people had participated in DARE? How many? So DARE is a drug resistance program for youth in common Massachusetts and other states, and what their experience was receiving DARE programming and sort of the prohibitionist perspective more broadly.
Right.
And Mostly I find that, these, of course, are college students, but, they're probably 5 years, 4 years removed from high school. They don't relate to that messaging.
Right.
They relate to a harm reduction. So harm reduction is how do you actually develop messaging around drug use more generally that is conscious of harms, but also conscious that people are going to potentially use these, sample them, try them, right? They have their own relationship to these substances, and how can you communicate safety and other, it's without necessarily, blasting that all drug use is horrible. Because certainly people are going to use things like alcohol, and if you don't communicate how to do that safely, then people might not know might not know their limits, might not know their ability to have that relationship, whatever that might be, and set their own policy.
And then how do we start to destigmatize the conversation around cannabis specifically and start to promote the idea of harm reduction instead of this is going to lead to your doom?
I think that we are starting to see people become more relaxed in their ability to show that they are a cannabis consumer. And I think that the policy will actually, I mentioned that there's legislation that would allow it to be illegal for an employer to terminate you for using cannabis. So I think that is a human right that people should have, to be able to utilize substances. And if they're not affecting anybody else, if they're not hurting other people, they're using their own body, then it should be okay. And I think that's being reflected in with legalization, those sentiments.
Okay. Thank you for that. And so now let's talk about the devastating impact that drug policies have had on communities, and specifically communities of color. And how do we start to repair some of the harm that have been done? You've talked about the equity fund, but are there other ways? For example, on our social media, some of our audience members mentioned taxing the cannabis industry and using the revenue to reinvest in communities of color that have specifically been affected by drug policies. How do we feel about some of these ideas? Are there any other innovative solutions out there that we should start thinking of? And where do you stand on reparations for the harms that have been caused?
Well, I would say one important factor that I think should be focused on by the state and the city is through the expungement of past criminal records for people who have gotten in trouble for cannabis.
Right.
Now that it's legal, there's no reason for people to still be harmed when there are legal entities doing the same thing.
Right.
And so currently there's a process where you can expunge your record, but it's time-based after, I believe, 7 years for a felony, 3 years for a misdemeanor.
Wow.
But in other states, in California, they've passed legislation where if you have a criminal record for cannabis, they'll automatically wipe it clean, automatic expungement. And I think that is something that we could use here in Massachusetts because just people who have criminal records generally don't understand or just generally don't understand that there's a process that you have to go through to get that off your record. It's not common knowledge. And so if the state would be proactive and just wipe away the records, just like our neighboring states have done, it could be beneficial for the systemic barriers that exist for people.
Okay.
And I think you also have a question. So here in Massachusetts, the cannabis industry is taxed, and some of that money, if the legislature passes a bill, would go towards helping businesses or helping folks get into the industry who want to. I do think that there is a broader question, and other states have done different things on this, of how do you really use that money how you use the money that is brought in with cannabis to help address social inequality, whether that's the specific social inequality that's created by the war on drugs or general social inequality. So I think here out in Illinois, they set aside 25% of all revenue, tax revenue coming from cannabis, into youth development programs and other sorts of social impact. So, some of the debate within sort of the social equity crowd, I think it's not so much a debate, just a difference of focus is whether you put that money towards helping develop businesses within the industry space, or whether potentially you put that money towards, say, like I mentioned, youth programs or whatever. I think there's space certainly to do both. It's just a question of what the focus is.
Okay.
Because a lot of these social equity programs sort of have this blur this line between reparations and economic development.
Okay.
And I think that there's a lot of we have to see that those programs have impact. And I think Joe's doing some really great work to push a program off the ground. But I think more broadly across the country, there's a lot of different strategies to try to develop those people who want to get into this industry, who have this prior illegal experience, and they want to make it legal. How do you successfully develop that market and make it sustainable even after federal legalization, even after 10 years, 20 years of legal market, after the market sort of settles down?
And then comparatively, how do we fare with other countries on this issue of cannabis legalization, decriminalization, stigmatization, all the different shins?
I mean, I think in terms of just having the opportunity there to legalize as compared to other countries, I think we're far ahead, because I think most countries have not had this conversation. Now, certainly countries in Europe have traditionally had a much more lax attitude towards, especially cannabis, but maybe some other substances as well. But here in the United States, we've certainly been able to use the opportunity to have the way federalism works, the way drugs were criminalized, which was mostly on the state level. Once states decided to change their laws to use ballot initiatives, there was that opportunity, that policy window where states took state voters here in Massachusetts and otherwise took the opportunity to essentially pull out the rug from criminalization. So that's a unique opportunity that most folks in other countries don't really have. Certainly specific countries like Uruguay and a couple of other, like Spain and Portugal, have gone a different direction on how they address drug criminalization more broadly, or not prohibition, but they've taken that harm reduction approach a little bit more seriously. I think part of it is a political elite versus sort of the popular will. Here in the United States, there's roughly 60% of people agree with cannabis legalization as a concept, but we still have, we have a Democratic Congress, Democratic president, and still haven't really had movement on that in 2 years. So, what that speaks to, it's a broader political discussion, but, there's certainly a resistance, I think, still in political, elected officials, maybe a conservatism, an institutional conservatism towards seeing what further opportunities there are there.
And I'm pretty grateful that we actually live in a country that is making forward steps for cannabis policy and drug policy, because in my home country of the Philippines, they actually do not look kindly at all to drugs, and you can get shot, you can get killed, extrajudicial killings for using drugs, and so we are definitely lucky to be in a space where they're actually recognizing that they need to change, and it's actually on paper, on the books. Whereas, if you look at Amsterdam, where it's pseudo legal, where you could get in trouble, you might not get in trouble, but they just turned a blind eye. I think it's better that we're moving away from turning a blind eye, and we're actually focusing on the laws and actually making it real here.
Thank you for that. Speaking of closed markets, black markets, what do we do with our local weed guys who have been providing communities with necessary services for years? Let's say federally weed becomes legal. The budman or the weed guy in the hood, where do they go? How do they make money? How do we invite them into the market economy instead of pushing them afar?
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the sort of demographic that I really want to cater to, because there are people who are operating on the underground market where it's just not going to be sustainable a few years from now. Even right now, there's a lot more access. When people before, they would go to their bud guy just because they didn't know where else to get it. But now like they can go across the street and get it. And so I would really highly encourage anybody who's in the underground market to take a look at the opportunities that exist with the equity programs, because you already understand this business model. You just need to formalize it, and then you can be legitimate with your business.
I definitely think there's a lot of states, as certainly Massachusetts, we're about 5 years in. States like Colorado, Washington, that have it's been legal for closer to 10 years, are seeing much of their, for lack of a better word, illicit market mostly go away. I think it's roughly 70-80% penetration in the legal market. So I think it's partially a price question, and I think this also has social equity implications as well. As the market becomes more and more developed, the price of cannabis falls dramatically because supply becomes very common, and so the illicit market generally can't compete with that after a certain point, and even a lot of established operators on the legal market also find it difficult to sustain their prices over time, and so that also pushes people out of the legal market as well, and then that again leads to this fewer suppliers, more monopolization potentially. So this is just a matter of what could happen, what things we need to be thinking about as the market continues to develop.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Do you have anything?
I would just say, like, the people who are selling weed right now, like, if you really want to get into it right now, you're going to need millions of dollars. And the only way to change it from being millions of dollars is to advocate for, better policies so that it's cheaper to get in the industry. So I would also say attend your city hall meeting and then, ask for more resources, ask for removal of these policies that are, they don't make any sense, but they're in place.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, and I look forward to continue working with you.